Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So in the early days of the pandemic lockdowns, when we didn't know much about how the next 2 years were going to play out, there were a lot of predictions going around. Like, for example, that with so many couples spending so much time alone together, we were going to see a huge baby boom. Thousands of babies born in the middle of a pandemic. What would their lives be like? And how would they adjust when it was all over? Well, now we finally have data from Statistics Canada released last month on what actually happened in those early days. And the conclusions aren't what you'd expect.
As one of the economists I spoke with put it, it's harder to get pregnant via Zoom.
Zosia Bielski is a national reporter for The Globe who writes about how we live together and apart and traces large-scale social shifts. And she recently wrote about this data and what it means. That's today on The Decibel. Hi, Zosia. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Tamara.
At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were predicting a baby boom. And it might seem really obvious, but can you tell me why? Like, what did people think was going to happen during the pandemic?
So in those very sort of early days, we're talking February, March 2020, I think there was a naive sense that we'd all get sort of a 2-week vacation working from home. It was a very naive view of what shape this would take. And so people thought, couples will be shacking up at home, husbands and wives will be home together for the first time, or partners, live-in partners. And the next prediction was that 9 months down the line, we'd see a baby boom. So it was a really naive early misconception of what this would look like, that it would be short term and that sort of lockdowns would be this fun vacation from reality. Mm-hmm. And slowly or quickly, rather, it became quite apparent that was not going to be the case. So that was a very early sort of giddy prediction without much experience behind it.
Yeah, so now we have this data from Stats Canada about how this all played out. And what did we actually see? Was there a baby boom or not?
There was a sizable baby bust, so quite the opposite from the early predictions. So 13,000 fewer babies were born in 2020 than 2019. And that was sort of a dramatic figure for even statisticians and economists who were, anticipating this. They had no idea the drop would be that dramatic that quickly. Because if you think about it, murmurs of the pandemic, January, February, WHO declares a pandemic in mid-March. And so families pivot really rapidly. So when you look 9 months out at November and December, those numbers have dropped. So this is the lowest fertility rate since 2006, 15 years essentially.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we'll get into why in a second. But is this Canadian data part of a broader global trend?
Absolutely. So we've got numbers out of France, Wales, and England, and the United States showing, anywhere between a 2.5 and 4% fertility drop between 2019 and 2020. Canada's was 3.6%.
What did you learn in your reporting about what drove this decline in birth rates?
Fear of the unknown. So it was very unclear how this would affect children in the early days. People were also afraid of entering the healthcare system and hospitals in the early days. So that was the initial trepidation about how this affects pregnant women, just a lack of information in the early days. And then as we went on, of course, economic insecurity, job loss, just people being very wary of bringing new life into the world, with so many unknowns around them.
And Zosia, you report on relationships. So can you tell us anything about relationship dynamics during the pandemic and how they may have played into what we're seeing here in the data?
Well, as we all sort of discovered, life in lockdown, with our partners posed all kinds of stressors. And I've spoken with a lot of sexuality researchers throughout the last 19 months. And lo and behold, it turns out that, a stressful environment with children at home, couples juggling their careers, financial insecurity, job loss, those aren't exactly the preconditions people want when they're building a family or even trying to be intimate. It just was not a sexy space the way people had sort of naively thought in the early days. I guess, I've been speaking with therapists, marriage counselors, desire researchers, all kinds of people in Canada who've been tracing the impact through the pandemic, doing really interesting journaling studies, getting people to really trace their thoughts over the last 19 months. And what I heard was that, the pandemic sort of revealed the cracks that might have been there. If you had a strong bedrock before, that continued. But if there were weaknesses and cracks in your relationships, the pandemic just widened them out. So we heard quite a bit about marital dissolution and just people learning who their partner is in a crisis. And when you find out something you don't want to see or something you haven't seen before, how your partner reacts in an emergency, if you're disappointed by that, there's an assumption that you may not be family planning with that person.
There was also an interesting part in your piece that you wrote about this, about how the number of babies born to women aged 15 to 19 plummeted. So it sounds like there was a drop in unplanned pregnancies.
Yeah, and that was sort of the most dramatic figure from the data. So pregnancies to women aged 15 to 19 plummeted to 5,600 or thereabouts. I went back 3 decades in the StatsCan data. That was the lowest figure in 3 decades. So as one of the economists I spoke with put it, it's harder to get pregnant via Zoom. Right. It points to the fact that at least in the early days of the pandemic, people were scared. People were staying home. Obviously, teens were home from high school. People weren't hooking up as much. Virtual dating sort of took hold. And so that fear trickled down to teens as well. Obviously, people worried about access to reproductive health. So not knowing if you'll have abortion access or access to contraception with everything shutting down so abruptly. So that was kind of a fascinating offshoot here, the unplanned pregnancy drop.
Social distancing as a form of birth control.
Exactly. Who knew?
So there was another thing in your piece that I wanted to highlight, which is the stoppage in fertility treatment. How did that contribute to the decline in births?
So unfortunately, the StatsCan data wasn't that granular. It didn't get into all the whys, but there's a clear feeling among many that this abrupt stoppage in IVF treatments really did play into the drop and obviously put some women behind in their family planning and maybe edged some people out of their fertility completely.
So we talked about how pregnancies went down among teens. Was the data consistent across age groups?
No, and that this was fascinating to work through the story, to look at all the cohorts, see the inconsistencies, and then mine that with the researchers and experts to find out why that is. So the 40 to 49 age group among women saw an increase actually in the pandemic. And so the clear answer there is when you're sort of weighing your fertility bracket, some people just couldn't afford to delay it by another year.
Yeah. So just like because there was no way of knowing when this whole thing would end, there were people who were like, I better just get this over with now.
Exactly.
And I know you talked to a lot of women who decided not to get pregnant during the pandemic. And I wonder what were some of the things that they were telling you? What were their anxieties?
So certainly a number of women decided to postpone, and a number of them ended up getting pregnant in the pandemic, but they sort of waited until the vaccines were on the horizon. Their fears were really multifold: fear of infection, fear of bringing something back from the hospital, real worry that their partner wouldn't be able to be in the delivery room with them, that they wouldn't have visits or support from family, as first-time parents. And all of that was tabulated really nicely in a St. Michael's Hospital study in the first wave. It really dove deep into women's precise anxieties. So one of the silver linings that my experts pointed out here was that the fact that women were so abruptly able to switch track on their fertility planning in Canada speaks to the safety net that women have in Canada and the fertility choices that women have in Canada and this ability to control when you have a child, how many children you have, how you choose to do it. And, they point to sort of like a robust availability of reproductive health options, the safety net that we have in terms of our parental leave, relative financial security for some of these women, and the ability to sort of choose if you want to delay this by a year, if that does fit your age bracket. So some of the researchers I spoke to were actually heartened by this delay and women's abilities to control the timing of their fertility amidst a crisis.
Yeah. And you also talked to women who actually did get pregnant. So what was it like for them?
Yeah. So, a number of them sort of got questions from family. One woman I spoke to had her first baby in the spring of 2020 and then became pregnant again later on. So she had sort of the double whammy. And when her midwife did her postpartum depression scale, found that it was quite high. So just palpable distress. And again, mothers worrying about what is the impact on my pregnancy right now, this distress. So some women described a feeling of like their brains short-circuiting with all the risk assessment that they were sort of being asked to do with these unpredictable waves through the pandemic. A few of the women that I spoke to really appreciated having time to sort of cocoon with their families during the pandemic. So normally they would have felt sort of inundated with visitors when they were home with their newborns. And in this case, that was completely off the table. So especially women who were having second children in the pandemic, who could compare the experience before and after, found that time was much more meaningful in lockdown, especially the first days with a newborn, that all of those social pressures to share fell away. And another woman mentioned that sort of living on Zoom with, the shoulders up view just gave her a lot more discretion about her pregnancy. It wasn't something she had to discuss with her colleagues or receive unsolicited advice, about her pregnancy. Just the social things that women often face in pregnancy, as some of the negatives there fell away.
So we're talking about what happened during the early stages of the pandemic, and we don't have data yet from the second part of the pandemic. So is it too early to say if this is a blip or if it's part of a broader trend?
I think what I've been hearing is that, of course, it was a blip because the conditions were so stressful and so unique. However, experts do suggest that there will be sort of offshoots and tentacles of this blip. So you're going to have people who really did age out of their fertility and don't have access to IVF treatments. So that may be a reverberation. Another point is that not only did this delay, the timing of your first or second child, but for those who are seriously planning their families and maybe dating and looking for a partner, that entire process was also delayed. So it's a blip with reverberations is what I'm hearing, with small reverberations. They don't, the experts don't feel this will necessarily repeat itself year after year because so many of women's fears fell away. We feel more confident going into a hospital setting. We know that this is not a virus like Zika virus that primarily affects infants. We have vaccines.
Right. Okay. So even if this is a blip in the data, what are experts saying could be the long-term effects of people having less babies during the pandemic?
It's such early days, and there are sort of murmurs of a late-stage pandemic baby boom.
Okay.
Anecdotally, a few doctors told me they saw the numbers skyrocketing in hospitals late this summer with people sort of playing catch-up. So there may be a bump back, but again, I think the feeling is that it's a blip and not sort of something that could affect, the country economically, for example, in terms of, a decrease in people entering the workforce.
I wanted to ask you about that too. Like in other countries, like Japan, for example, this has reached crisis levels and they're very worried about the birth rate there because they also have an aging population and it's created this huge economic crisis because there's a labor shortage. So based on this data and how it fits into what's been happening in Canada over the last many years, is that something that we should be worried about here yet?
That wasn't my sense from the experts. They just think the numbers in other years are still holding fairly steady. We have this myth that there's a grand decline, but they said that the numbers are fairly steady, again, with a little peak and valley year after year. Obviously, this year was quite different, but they don't foresee that that's going to repeat itself year in, year out. In terms of labor shortages, we have a robust culture of immigration where newcomers obviously factor in here in terms of our workforce. So I'm not getting that anxiety from the sources I spoke with. everyone's saying the 2021 numbers will paint an even fuller picture because we will have known what life is like in lockdown. Mm-hmm. But we'll have to wait for Statistics Canada to pull that together next year.
Okay, Zosia, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakter. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich, with editing today from Michal Stein. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Zosia Bielski. You can find her on Twitter at ZosiaBielski. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow.